This is the inaugural event of what we hope will become a very lively series of discussions. And we in this context is former MEPs. And our aim is to try and get some proper in-depth discussion of problems in society and to try and get some free thinking about what can be done to try and combat them and what is being done and what I just want to bring good minds together to talk about potential solutions to society's ills, if you like. That sounds very depressing, but you know what I mean. The debate today is a truthful press and media, misinformation, disinformation, and truthful hyperbole. One other subtitle that was suggested, and it does seem slightly appropriate in connection with the treatment of Nick Watts in recent days, is facts in a time of feeling. You may want to think in those terms as well. So the discussion is split into 3 sections. You all should have a programme. Here in the room, we also have photos of people so that you can identify who's speaking. Yes, you don't have those in Zoom land. I would ask that everybody who speaks identifies themselves every time. There isn't time for a great long introduction about yourselves. You know, 20 people, that would take half the meeting. But if you can say your name and what your allegiance is, then that would be very helpful to everyone. What we're looking for, the third topic, is where we are looking for practical solutions to these problems. We actually are trying to think, what is it that society, that publishers, that journalists, and that policymakers could do to actually make, to improve matters? And whose responsibility really is it to act? Being a round table, everybody will have an opportunity to speak on every topic. Lead named people for each topic, which is on your programme, which you should have received by email. You also got a cheap version on your seat. Named people on each topic get up to 5 minutes. I'm going to be a little bit strict about this, so you will be warned and then you will be asked to stop. Everybody else gets a minute, and this is European Parliament rules. In European parliamentary debates, you get a minute. My advice to you is start with the good stuff, because it's all too easy to start with a slow beginning and then you get cut off just before you get to the important part that you really want to share. So we're aiming at a minute for all other contributions. And I believe that's all of my housekeeping. The next person to speak is Lucy Nethsingha, who is the former chair of the Legal Affairs Committee in the European Parliament. And Lucy is going to tell us why she felt particularly that this should be the topic we discussed today.
Okay, I'm going to be quite brief because we are starting quite late and there's a lot to discuss, and I have another slot later on, so I can say a bit more. Just to introduce myself, I was the MEP for the East of England. I am now the leader of Cambridgeshire County Council. These issues, I got particularly interested in this topic when I became the chair of the jury committee at the European Parliament, who have responsibility for regulation and copyright, civil law matters. So copyright was something that we were discussing a lot. And I also got lobbied by Nick Clegg, so I thought I'd better go and do some reading. When I was doing this reading, I came across this amazing, I can't hold it up, but there's a really, really impressive European Commission topic, which is called Understanding Our Political Nature. And the first chapter of this talks a lot about how much more difficult it is to change somebody's mind if they are misinformed than if they are uninformed. And that if you have misinformation, if you have information which is incorrect, it is then that very, very much more difficult to change somebody's view on something than if they know that they know nothing. And the position that we're in at the moment, with an enormous quantity of misinformation out there on the internet, means that it's actually much more difficult to then persuade people of accurate information because they believe that they are informed. And that's sort of where I started getting interested in this. As a British MEP, clearly misinformation was quite high on my agenda, given what we've had since then with the COVID pandemic, and now as somebody who has significant responsibility for public health, at the moment we have issues with vaccine uptake in my area, misinformation becomes even more important. So this is not a topic which has become less important, and I think it's something that we need to really focus on, and it comes from so many different directions. It's a really, really complex, knotty issue to try and resolve. So I'm not expecting we're going to be able to resolve it in these discussions, but I do think it's a really important thing that we should be talking about. I think that's enough for me at this point, because I get to come back later. Shall I hand this back to you?
So the first speaker on this topic is Martina, and I did practice this, Bilzjukovic. She is a little delayed and has asked we move to the end of that list. So Nick, are you happy to pick up now? You have up to 5 minutes to tell us your thoughts and your experiences.
Okay, maybe I should start by trying to describe the origins of the problem. So number one, obviously, is social media operating as an information sewer, spreading falsehood on a scale and at a speed that has never been possible before in human history. Okay, we could take that as a given. The more interesting area to look at is mainstream media and its contribution to the distribution of falsehood and distortion. The first thing to understand there is that because the internet has broken the model of almost all news organizations in the developed world, journalism is no longer capable of performing its function properly. It doesn't have the resources to go out and find the stories itself and check the truth of what they're picking up, which is a really, really important structural problem. If you take that and put it in the background as a very important fact, look at how it combines with the growth of an industry which really scarcely existed when I became a reporter in the mid-1970s. This is the public relations industry. It sounds like a perfectly innocent thing, but in the context of mainstream news organizations not being able to perform their function, the result is we've reached a point which would have been unthinkable in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, that governments, corporations, trade unions, celebrities are able to decide over and over again what the supposedly free press says about them. This doesn't necessarily involve lies. Sometimes it does. If you could quantify the proportion of PR activity which is actually false, it would probably be 5%. It's relatively rare, but it's important. What's much more important is they get to decide what truths we tell about them. They manage the news, they manipulate. And more news organizations simply passively recycle what those powerful people have decided we should say about them. And that you could categorize as distortion. So like, just to give you a concrete example, if you were the press officer for the Metropolitan Police, and you come in the morning and on the log it says that the assistant commissioner, no names here and entirely fictional, last night happened to be so drunk that he had to be taken home in a car and put to bed. But also on the log it says that a young officer is getting a medal this morning because they rescued a baby from a burning building. Well, you as the press officer have to decide which story to put out. You've got 2 seconds. It isn't a difficult choice. You know what they're going to put out. And the press will recycle that. Because of their weakness, they won't even know about the drunken assistant commissioner, let alone have the time to check it and put it into print. Alongside the PR industry, there is propaganda. This is military and intelligence agencies who fabricate entirely false stories in order to achieve a diplomatic, political, or military end. And that too is being fed into these passive mainstream news organizations who are not capable of discerning truth from falsehood. That's a slight overstatement of the case, but that's the trend. So that if you stand back and look at it, I mean, the other point also is that where we started with social media, they too feed into mainstream media, so that PR, propagandists, and lunatics and malevolent players, including foreign intelligence agencies, can use social media to inject falsehood and distortion into mainstream media. So it's quite a complicated structure. and it won't be dealt with by any kind of simplistic maneuver. It needs a really clever, I suppose you'd say, multifaceted approach to try and unpick it and get us back to a world in which the truth has some kind of primacy.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Chris. Sorry, Nick. Thank you. And I'm now going to call on Evan Harris. Welcome. Sorry, didn't get to say hello before, but you have up to 5 minutes to tell us of your experiences and your thoughts on this topic. These are now working. Okay, thank you, Irina. You can stand up and pace if you wish. Or
Can I be seen by the...
You can be seen.
Well, I'm happy to move somewhere where I can't.
I can't see Evan. I'm very disappointed.
Actually, no, you're too close to the screen. If you'd like to walk up this end. Come.
It's not often we have a real celebrity.
I'd like to be as far distant as possible. So if you can wave in the distance. Yes. So I come to this. I'm a former executive director of Hacked Off. I was a parliamentarian for many years, where I was particularly interested in, from a human rights perspective, in freedom of expression. But during my last few years, up to 2010, I noticed the other side of the Article 10, Article 8 divide, which was the intrusion that was clearly taking place, which Nick Davies had written about. And I was just searching. I searched on the first mention of Nick Davies's breakthrough 2009 article in July 2009 in the House of Commons, and it was me. I raised it in Parliament, and I don't remember having done that, even though I then spent the next 10 years of my life relying on his research. So when I left Parliament, I became involved in the Hacked Off campaign, which was designed to find a way of ensuring that there was independent press regulation which protected investigative journalism and freedom of expression, but also tried to ensure that the rights of individuals, especially those without the recourse to law, that is, people without expensive or even cheap lawyers, if such things exist, that the rights of individuals were protected, and that we could improve the truth telling, or if not the truth telling, the correction setting of the press in particular. So I specialized in the press. And is it a deficit that I looked at this only in terms of the press and not broadcast? Not really in this country, because broadcast is independently regulated. So there is a mechanism, whatever the criticisms there are of broadcast, and with new entrants into the field, I think there will be more complaints. There is somewhere to go that is reasonably independent and accessible, at least in terms of dealing with accuracy and distortion, and under UK law, the need for a balanced output. And indeed, when you look at the Martin Bashir business, you have an organization that actually did an independent investigation led by a judge that was highly critical, and then broadcast it on its quotes front page on its mainstream programs. If you contrast that with the press, there is no independent regulation. They're in favor of judge-led independent inquiries except into them when they are against it, and they work corruptly with politicians to work against casting sunlight on what they've done. And they would never publish, and you can see this with the recent Daniel Morgan panel report, any element that's critical of them, they won't publish. So so I object to the use of the term media, British media in particular, my area, when considering these things, because there's a huge difference between the broadcast media and the press. And then you ask the question, well, where does social media fit in? Now, social media is full of distortion, it's full of hate speech, it's full of misinformation. But polls show, surveys show, proper across international surveys show that it is not as trusted as broadcasters in particular, and generally isn't as trusted as things that have editors. Okay, So obviously present company accepted, but a lot of people don't exercise much editorial control on their social media, naming no names. But they don't pause to think. Whereas by definition, when you have a journal, a newspaper, which says it has a high editorial standard, someone is casting a view, and that's why they say you can trust them. And although if you look at surveys of trust in the media in Britain, tabloid newspapers come out very badly, barely above the random musings of people on their social media feeds. Among the readers of those newspapers, it's much higher. So so you do have a problem that what comes out of these unregulated, still in certain cases, cesspits of misinformation, distortion, and intrusion is believed by that group. So if there is a problem of echo chamberism, which there is in social media, it also applies to the press. But that's not talked about, especially by the press. They talk about the problem of online media because obviously it impacts on their business model. So we have proposals in the online hate legislation to regulate social media, to bring it in some way, your and my Twitter feed, if you like. But the exception will be newspapers. If they can pretend to be regulated as they are by their non-regulator poodle, Ipso, then they will not be subject to any regulation. So you'll have media, you'll have the newspapers unregulated, and then you'll have increasing regulation of social media, which is not without free speech implications. So that is the background against which we're working. And the problem in the room is often the one that's ignored and ignored by itself.
Okay, thank you very much, Evan. That's very good. And Marie. Yes.
Right, am I in vision?
No.
No, I'm gonna have to.
Hang on, no, hold on, I can do something about that. Whoop.
Now you are.
There you are. There we go.
Brilliant. So my name's Marie Helly. I lead on a World Service project called Beyond Fake News. And I just, before I start on that, I just, Evan mentioned the Martin Bashir case, and it is so relevant because I have to say, I'm not going to go into it, but all our colleagues are heartbroken, and we're heartbroken because we really understand that the only thing we can trade in is trust. And if our trust is broken, then there is no meaning to the BBC and there's no meaning to what we do. And so, although we have many programs and fact checking and reality checking and, many interesting programs, none of it means anything unless people trust us, trust what we say, and trust who we are. So this kind of thing is very damaging for us, and we're very well aware of it. And although it's, it's lovely to say, of course, we put it on our front pages and we interrogate where we can ourselves, it doesn't undo the damage of those headlines. So we are aware. In terms of what we do specifically, so I don't think it's a coincidence that the programme that has been driving our anti-misinformation content has come from the World Service. In 2018, we decided that we needed to do more than just create trusted news stories. We put our journalism out there and the people will come. And actually, see, that's very recent, isn't it? That most journalists in the BBC would have thought, we don't need to tackle this. This isn't something for us. People were very resistant to kind of getting engaged in this because we put our journalism out there and people find us, and we don't really want to try and get involved in telling people probably, what did they think? What should they think? However, we realized that although there was a problem in English and people understood, increasingly understood things about bot factories and bad actors and Russians and the American elections, all these things were sort of circling around, quite freely by 2018. In the UK, people still didn't really think this was something about us. I mean, that's kind of amazing, isn't it? Only 3 years ago. And it was about Americans, and it was about Russians, and it was about being aware of bots. But what we were aware of was because we have 42 languages, that there was incredible harm being done on the ground, that in India, there was a whole spate of murderous mobs where people were sharing content on social media about, you know, sort of classic stranger danger. I mean, it's not unique, but it was leading, you know, to, I think there was about 30 deaths over a couple of months. It was shocking numbers. And it was because people suddenly had cheap smartphones, very cheap smartphones with free data as long as it had Facebook. And the news was Facebook, and people didn't really understand, especially in these rural areas where things were happening, you know, in appalling ways, that, you know, the internet wasn't as the social media provider that they had. And so Beyond Fake News, which is my project, kind of grew from that, which was, how do we reach out to people who don't really understand, who are not media literate, you know, even more so than here, and who don't really even understand the internet, and who suddenly have this data. So a lot of the work we're doing around the world is trying to reach out and kind of encourage that kind of critical thinking and understanding. It's kind of integrate it into the journalism that we do. So there's a lot of training going on for our journalists, you know, especially across India and Africa, about how do you share anti-vax messages without amplifying headlines. We know people just read headlines now. That's a huge problem for us. How do you get people to read the small print? Reality Check is our biggest brand, a fact-checking brand, but really there is a problem there in that it just kind of super serves the elites in, certainly in the UK and beyond. You know, to read the nuances and grey areas of a BBC reality check, you're pretty engaged. You're not, you know, it's not going to change the hearts and minds of our wider audiences. So I'd say the journey we've had in the last 3 years, really thinking about the UK and globally, is how do we reach those people who are sharing conspiracy theories? I mean, COVID has been an astonishing moment for us, hasn't it? I mean, for the BBC, I have to say, it's, you know, in some ways it's been, you know, it's been good for business. I mean, our numbers globally are up ×5, you know, incredible numbers. People asking simple questions like, you know, what is COVID? How can I how do I avoid it? You know, asking us questions, really simple questions. And so I think the road we're on is we still want to do the high impact, you know, investigative stuff, but we want to reach out to people who are getting anti-vax messages, or who will be who are having their rights as citizens undermined with harmful information. And we're not there yet. This is where we are. We're investing in it, but we are certainly haven't got any answers yet. But that's where we are at the moment.
Thank you, Marie. Martina from the European External Action Service hasn't arrived yet. She is still coming, so we will move on and incorporate her as she arrives, which means, would you like to raise hands, or shall we just go round the room in order? Round the room in order, okay? You're too slow. So we'll start with Catherine over here, if you would. So Catherine Bearder, former MEP.
Hello.
For the
yes,
Catherine
Bearder, former MEP, a leader of the group, leader of my own group when I was there on my own, and then I was joined by these 60 wonderful MEPs. When we stood on a ticket of Stop Brexit, a clear, simple message that resonated with the public. Half the country voted for us, half the other wanted to leave, and I think we're still not much different from that. I find, Marie, your comments about the cheap phones and the easy headlines that are spreading fear around the world quite interesting. And I always go to the World Service when I want, especially when I was traveling around, to get the clear picture of what was going on, even more so than the UK news. But I don't know how we get over that. Historically, I think we've got over that when the printing press was printed and things were going up on walls, they had to bring in legislation. But actually what saved people was education. And we haven't really got time for that, because we know that we're talking about people around the world who have no access to education, but they do have access to this misinformation or disinformation.
10 seconds.
Okay, so really, I find that as a real challenge to us, and I don't know whether that's a question or not. But to me, it's one of the most worrying things, because fear spreads an awful lot quicker than the truth and good news.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm being a bit more generous with time because we've done quite well so far, but don't go over the top, Phil. Okay, Phil.
Probably question to Evan if he's still with us. Yes, he was very concentrating on his iPad there. The tabloid press. How much of the problem is due to ownership? Obviously, a lot of the press is owned by individuals who are extremely wealthy and have particular interests. They have their own interests, and there's some doubt about sort of editorial freedom, I think, in some of these organs. But for instance, if Soros or Gates were the owners of these organs, would it actually improve things if we had other tabloid newspapers that were looking from a more liberal direction? Or is actually the real is it inimical towards these organs that they actually need this sort of shock jock type journalism, which doesn't lend itself to the more liberal views? You know, there are forms of entertainment. Is it actually just too difficult to produce that sort of material with a more liberal perspective, or do you think it could be done and is simply an issue of ownership? So that's my main question.
Okay,
I'd also note that nobody's mentioned trolling. Now, I've been very lucky with my trolls. I've only got 2 of them, and I know both of them actually very well, whereas most trolls, I think, are unknown to people.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Phil. And now, Richard, this is Richard Allan, Lord Richard Allan, from the European Digital Media Observatory.
Thanks very much. And I've been working on tech policy issues probably for about 20 years in different capacities on the political side, but also, probably importantly for this discussion, I spent 10 years working at Facebook, so I can know from that side.
Yeah.
Just the observation at this stage is that people tend to see the problem through their own lens. It's really hard to get a common definition of what the problem is because we all see it through our own lenses, and the same kind of activity we can feel very differently about depending on where we sit. Just to pick a very specific example, this section, we talked earlier about India, Marie talked about India. You know, the Indian government may come and say there is a problem with dangerous misinformation circulating on social media that is leading to disorder and death. And in that case, it may well be that somebody is stimulating kind of interreligious conflict, and it is dangerous, and probably we would all agree something should be done about it. The Russian government will come and use exactly the same language about content being distributed by Alexei Navalny, dangerous extremist content, and misinformation should be removed. So just as a very specific example, you get these differences. The same behavior is seen very differently depending on where we all sit politically, and we need to understand that. And then within a democracy, what one regards as dangerous or inappropriate misinformation, again, will depend on who's putting it out. So there's no coincidence that the big sort of drive around this came as a reaction to Trump and Brexit victories. Had those elections, it felt like had those elections gone the other way, we would have been having a very different debate. So just to say that we need to recognize what we bring to the table when we talk about this problem, and there isn't a common definition. There's a million definitions depending on where you sit.
Thank you. So now Richard Reeves, who is the CEO of the Association of Online Publishers.
Yes, which is a trade body that represents the interests of the creators of quality original online content. I'm sort of going to dip to some notes because we recently ran an event in March on this topic ourselves. And I think we can see that journalism is under tighter scrutiny than ever. And this development isn't just natural, it is necessary. But I want to frame some of what's been said here before me, and obviously later I'm talking to some of the solution. You know, we still find challenges with ensuring true stories are heard and earning confidence, but online fragmentation creates an overwhelming chorus of voices, it's becoming increasingly difficult for readers to distinguish those credible sources. We recognise that. We invited Reuters Institute to our event, who talked to some statistics, which I think Nick touched on earlier, but the last few years have brought an increasing decline of media trust, especially in the news. And according to the Reuters Institute, faith has fallen from 51% to just 28% in 2020. Largely the result of two core factors, he suggests: evolving consumer attitudes and habits. A series of polarizing situations have seen passions run high and deeper divisions drawn, which leads to skepticism of journalism that individuals don't believe, and this is the key point here, represents their viewpoint. These issues obviously aren't helped by the growth of social media usage, and citing findings, this is Reuters again, that almost 1 in 3 consumers discover news via social media.
10 seconds.
Automated news feed curation now means each person is presented, if you like, with a version of their own reality, which is just constantly reflecting existing opinion. We do lead the way here in the UK for the charge of holding social platforms to greater account in legislation. Equally, there is a need for the industry to understand and accommodate what today's audiences see on digital media.
Thank you, Richard. Very good. Thank you for stopping. Okay, I'd now like to go to Kari Kivinen on Zoom. Are you happy and prepared for your comments? Could you unmute? I have to ask you.
Yep. Now I'm on mute. I'm representing here education and the Finnish education and fact checking. I've been working for that for the past years. And I have a little bit different approach than all of you, especially that we cannot do anything. We can do something. We are all facing a new reality, online world, which is different than offline world. And we have not yet created enough skills and competencies to deal with this online world, with online. I mean, anybody can say something and it's spread in seconds to millions. This is not happening in the offline world. The problem on information management is also same. In the good old times, we went to library, we found a book, what we're looking for, encyclopedias. Now when we go Google, we get millions of hits. And it's up to us individual citizens to try to find out which of the information out of the millions of hits is correct. And unfortunately, big platforms are also kind of disturbing the research results. They are giving priorities for paid using technologies. And we don't know how it works. It's not transparent. So we are kind of dealing with new online environment where the rules are still non-existing. And this is something, the only thing I'm going to propose as a solution this afternoon is developing a critical thinking starting from early education. And in Finland, we are quite far on that. And I will share my findings and our approach later on today.
Super, thank you, Kari. And then if we could go to Shaffaq Mohammed. Are you with us still, Shaffaq? Oh, Shaffaq's disappeared. Okay, and Nick, you've had a go. So Alexandra, would you like to take the floor? And could you unmute? Lovely.
Yes. Hello, thank you once again, Jodie, for organizing it and for having me. I miss you truly in Brussels. It's very timely debate. I come from Poland, Judith knows that. In Poland, we have the problem of disinformation, fake news, and state-owned broadcasters that are introducing through censorship. So for us, it is a bigger problem, I think, than for most of the countries on the European continent. However, for disinformation, I think disinformation is much more grave and dangerous than fake news, because fake news we can quickly dismiss. We have plenty of websites and people engage who are tracing fake news, and they can be very quickly proven wrong. However, disinformation and exaggerating the importance of the real context, giving new meanings and omitting the context may mislead recipient and lead to radicalization of attitudes. I can give you a very silly example from the Polish press that I saw last week actually, during the Roland Garros French Open tournament. There was a headline on the Polish newspaper saying, Andy Murray, your tennis player, is in love with Polish tennis player, but he just tweeted that I love the way she plays. But the media said it just to catch the eye, said Andy Murray claims he's in love with Iga Świątek. So this kind of tricks are really, really dangerous, and it's growing problem. What I was looking now, what the EU is doing, and I found also one project organized by the Polish Geremek Foundation. Geremek was a Polish liberal Democrat, but like 10 years ago, and then unfortunately he passed away, but he has a very famous Geremek Foundation in Poland, and they have a project called Keyboard Warriors. So this is an organization of civil society people who try to correct the language used in Polish media. I will share the links with Judith. Maybe it will be of use for you to see, because I just learned that the project got some awards from European Union and it's growing in popularity. So my takeoff would be that disinformation is much graver than fake news, especially on European and Polish context. And that civil society has to organize itself, and of course education is key. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Then we've lost Shaffaq completely. If one of my MEP colleagues could text him and ask Shaffaq where he is, then we could fit him in at the end. And then we come back into the room, and I will move to Irina.
Thank you very much, Judith, and welcome everyone. I was MEP for London, and I'm currently on the Liberal Democrat Policy Working Group entitled Nature of Public Debate, where we discuss similar topics. And I also worked as a lawyer in the ICT industry for many years. And I can really only second what Kari has pointed out in terms of the necessity of education, because we were looking not just as disinformation, but also electoral manipulation, which of course is related, bots, etc. And at all of the technical means, fact-checking, etc. But ultimately, I think what it boils down to is education early, starting in primary schools, media literacy, and the ability to look at the motivation behind information, and also the differentiation between facts and opinion, which I hope we will talk about when we have our third topic in terms of remedies. But this really is my comment for this very interesting first part of the discussion. So thank you, and I'll pass the mic.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And yes, on to Stefanie. Stefanie, who is the London correspondent for Die Welt.
Is that working? Yeah. Can I also just ask a question? And I don't
yes,
want to
of course
comment actually. Evan, could you elaborate a bit on what you said about that there's far more scrutiny on the broadcasters than the press? I didn't quite understand the argument you make. Is that the legal reason, or it's simply the Murdoch power? Thank you.
Well, there's a statutory regulator of the broadcast media in this country. So by statute, anyone with a broadcasting license is regulated. And part of that regulation is not only accuracy, but there has to be a non-bias overall in the output. It'll be interesting to see how GB News manages to get away with that. But that's why Fox closed up in this country, because they knew they couldn't sustain that. They pretended it was another reason, but that was the reason, I think. So that's the reason. I've got an answer for Phil, but I'll wait to my turn. But there is a difference. There is statutory regulation, Ofcom.
And in Germany, we have something that's called a Presserat. So that's an independent council, Presserat it's called. So if Bild Zeitung or any other newspaper has a headline that's completely untrue, they have to, the Presserat will come and force them to put a correction on their front page or whatever. Does that not exist here?
No, for a long time we've had a self-regulator, which doesn't regulate, it's a complaints handler. And it has a rule that as long as the article in paragraph 19 makes clear what the headline should have said, it's okay. And even when that doesn't happen, they don't require same size corrections. So a fraction of the people who are misled by the original story or headline see it. And that's the mainstream press who choose to be regulated in that way. There is an official sensible regulator, but it's only regulating, because there's no compulsion, despite recommendation of the Leveson inquiry, it's only regulating small journals, and the Guardian lost the nerve and is standing on its own with the Independent, and not part of the poodle, but also not part of the effective regulator.
Thank you. Oh. So I've got to stop you there, Richard, code, because they can't hear on Zoom unless you have the microphone. So I'm going to move on to Lucy now, who gets her comment. Because you started, you're happy? That was a separate start. Okay, now do any of our original speakers, we're doing quite well for times, if Marie or Evan or Nick would like to pick up a minute, or indeed Richard, would you like to have a microphone for a moment? Because Martina is still trying to join us, but they have connection problems. So we can make space for her.
Yeah, I mean, do you know what, I'm just going back to, because there was something else that I sort of wanted to touch on, but I think it was one thing at this event that we had where a particular journalist talked to a point saying essential to winning back audience trust is recognizing that perceptions of truth are often highly varied. And I think this has been talked to. Broadly, journalism follows a rigid definition of truthful and high quality content, well-written, research, corroborated, and fact-checked. But audience concepts are more nuanced. And I think this is a recognition for a lot of journalists at the moment, with reader interpretations depending on unique beliefs. Their verdict on quality is subjective. In other words, a lot of people will reject media if it's not telling them what they want to hear. And I think that is also one of the main challenges that we have. But again, I'll talk more to the solutions as we move forward.
Thank you. And Nick, you take your minute now. That's
sorry, Nick.
I disagree profoundly with what's just been said. So on the one hand, yes, we need to remind people of the skills of critical thinking, as our Finnish friend was saying. Education is incredibly important to get people back to the basics about understanding the difference between truth and falsehood. But what is really misleading and dangerous nonsense is to present contemporary journalism as a source of fact-checked, corroborated truth. Mainstream media is a significant part of the problem. And if you think of the problem simply as being lunatic anti-vaxxers, you're missing the big picture. We've left the European Union on a tide of falsehood, most of which was generated by the mainstream media and recycled over and over again. Never mind what happened on January the 6th in Capitol Hill. That's crazy people. Look at what happened in the November election when Donald Trump won 8 million more votes than he had in November 2016. A lot of that is to do with mainstream media failing to do its job. So yes, let's look at the recipients of falsehood and try to educate them, but you have to look at the sources, and it isn't just nutcases on social media. And with mainstream media, two things have to happen. First, in an ideal world, we have to start taxing those huge digital organizations, skimming their profits and putting it back into the mainstream media so that they can recruit people and train people and get back to what they should be doing with fact checking. And secondly, which is Evan's strong point, we need a decent independent regulator so that when newspapers, and it's not just tabloids, the quality press are highly unreliable in this country. Don't imagine that the Times or the Guardian are sources. So we need the regulation and we need the funding to get the mainstream media back to doing its job.
Thank you. Marie, would you like to have an additional comment at the end?
Yeah, I think everyone's touched a nerve here. Sorry, I'm booming, aren't I?
No,
everyone's touched a nerve here about people wanting to hear what they want to hear. And so obviously Nick is correct that, you know, the whole kind of manipulation of who's saying what is very, very difficult. but it's, can we turn back the clock, and people, you know, sort of embracing what we might think of as old-fashioned impartial journalism. And so there are certain sort of things that we're thinking about where we are trying to say, well, here are the 5 facts you need to know, because you want to try and tap into that the kind of zeitgeist at the moment of opinion journalism. How do you kind of grab that, but give it that kind of the bit of attitude and the kind of feeling of the moment, where it's, you are saying, here's what you really need to know about, I don't know, Trump or QAnon or education, but you give it in that kind of, you've got to kind of give it in that way. You've kind of got to modernize the way you say things. The whole language and discourse has got to kind of figure a way around this kind of opinion versus fact journalism, which I think is really at the heart of the problem, because we just don't know how to pull the audiences back. You know, that is a big challenge for us.
Thank you. And Lucy is going to, oh yes, sorry, Evan.
I just wanted to reply to Phil. Can I first say that whatever the problems, and I was conscious of the fact that my area of expertise is the UK, whatever the problems, and Phil identifies one with right-wing press ownership, a bigger problem is what we see in Hungary and Poland with authoritarian governments controlling much of the media. And let's just get some perspective. That's important to note. Having said that, Phil asks an important question. Could we have, you know, tabloids of the left that were equally effective? And I think, and I don't think you can. I've spent a long time now looking at what's happening in the US. The MSNBC is not an equivalent of Fox. They can't bring themselves to be that false for the left, as it were, and they don't get the viewership. Fox is still outstripping them because of their opinion journalism, quasi-news, quasi-opinion journalism. So I think it is a unique factor of the authoritarian, illiberal side on the right, without being too factional. And you might say, as Richard said, I would say that, wouldn't I? But trying to stand back. And I think there is a real problem of cancel culture, by the way, on the left. I've always been hostile to no platform, and we see it to a degree. I'm with Bill Maher on this, that side of liberal approach, and I hope our party gets it right on this. But to answer your question, yes, it's true that the people who own newspapers are often on the right. But nevertheless, it doesn't necessarily mean that you do lead to this right-wing populism in the editorial. You can look at the Washington Post, which has its faults, and Jeff Bezos has his faults, but you don't see as direct an influence, or hardly an influence, on their editorial that you see from the owners of the Murdoch press and the Telegraph and so forth. So I think it is probably incurable, and the only answer is regulation, and also just fight back the propaganda that it's a free press. It's not the free press, it's the free speech of those 5 tax-shy billionaires who control about 70% of our press in the UK.
I draw you to a close, thank you. And Lucy is claiming her moment, because you do get a moment. No, it's okay, you just get your minute, like everybody else.
Okay, so this is my 1 minute on this particular topic, which is what I wanted to come back on just now, was that who's paying is really, really important. And one of the issues about who's paying for the media now is that actually it's not really people buying a newspaper in the way that they used to and paying for the information. They're paying with their short attention span, very short attention span often, and the people who are paying are often the advertisers or the very rich. And the very rich are paying not because they have the interests of the people buying the newspapers in mind, but they have their own interests in mind. And whether they're the very rich on the right or the very rich on the left, they have a massive interest in maintaining the status quo because they are the very rich. And it doesn't really, so the fact that there is a huge problem with the payment for high quality journalism which is coming back to the next point, I think, is deeply, deeply connected to the fact that we don't get high quality journalism, that there isn't a mechanism in the system at the moment other than the BBC, for example, and other kind of very heavily regulated areas which tend to be supported by national governments for paying for valid media. All the drivers are in the other direction. And I'm in danger of getting into the next section.
Yeah,
so
I was going to say, so stop there. Thank you. So everyone, thank you. That's the first topic finished. Thank you for sticking to time. I'm going to give you 3 minutes to go to the loo and make a cup of coffee. and then we will launch into the second topic, which is protection versus free speech. We are moving on with the second topic, which is protection versus free speech. And I am going to invite Lucy again. I hadn't realized quite how much I'd made this bit of the meeting the Lucy show, but I'm inviting Lucy to speak on this first. Then we have Marcus Ryder, who's joining us, I believe, from Malaysia. Is that right?
That's correct.
And then Stefanie Boltzen of Welt, who is here in the room. So, Lucy, off you go. You have up to 5 minutes.
So I will try not to use my 5 minutes, having just used up some of my time just before. So I think this is a really interesting debate and a really difficult problem, the free speech versus protection problem. And again, this is something I've been aware of for some time, because as a Liberal Democrat in Cambridge, where Julian Huppert was the MP before and was fighting very hard in favour of free speech, as a parent, I have slightly different views, and it's a very difficult balance. So when I became the chair of the jury committee in the European Parliament, one of the first and still unresolved discussions that I had with some of my Renew colleagues and many other MEP colleagues was in the area of copyright. There had been an ongoing major debate about copyright within the European Parliament and within the political groups there. There were several of my Renew colleagues, and I also know, living in Cambridge, a number of academics who were very, very keen on the loosest possible copyright laws, that there should be almost no copyright, everything should be free for access. My perspective on this is somewhat different, as I have been married for 25 years to a musician who works in cathedral music and who not only has to deal with copyright issues, but also has to deal with really complicated, sensitive child protection issues in terms of broadcasting children. So I have a very different perspective on the need for copyright, both in terms of needing to provide income for people who produce creative products and non, I mean, it's just as true for all sorts of science issues as well, actually. But also the need to protect individuals who need protecting, who, I mean, the most obvious set of whom are children, but there are actually lots of other groups of individuals who need protecting for various different reasons. Since then, I've become even more interested in this topic in discussions with my now kind of my teenager and young adult children in relation to how, to the impact of pornography on what has become normalized sexual behavior. And this came up in the press very recently, but it's something that I've been increasingly aware of over the last couple of years, and it really is only the last couple of years. So there is this really, really difficult balance between a society where we would like everybody to have the right to free speech, and a society where giving people the right to free speech is actually doing potentially really quite serious damage to some of those in our society who need protection, and also potentially quite serious damage to what we consider to be normal behaviour. And I think that this is where the pornography industry is really difficult. There has been some very interesting discussions around this, and one of them focuses on the question of how you drive traffic towards particular websites. And I think this is particularly true in the pornography area. But actually, if you can't see what the algorithms are doing, and if what the algorithms are doing is driving people towards ever more extreme content, and quite extreme content comes up quite quickly, that's a real problem. But at the moment, we have no visibility about what those algorithms are doing. And I think that that's an area where there's a real need for regulation. But that regulation is going to have to be done with the collaboration, in my view, of the big companies, because I don't think anybody else is going to be able to have the mechanisms to do it if they're not doing it in collaboration. I do feel that there is a change in the last, so when I was discussing this some time ago with Julian, he was fighting very hard with those big companies saying, no, we're not publishers, we don't have any responsibility for this. I think they've got to the stage where they don't believe that anymore. I hope this is correct, where they just realize that actually they are going to have to take responsibility at some level for what is on their websites. I think they've created a monster. I don't think anybody knows how to do it yet, but my goodness, it's important that we do. Is that enough?
That's fine. Thank you very much. Thank you. And I'd now like to move on and hand over to Marcus. Marcus, I haven't introduced people in detail. If you can include that in your 5 minutes, that would be great. Thank you.
Sure, thank you so much. My name is Marcus Ryder. I have just been appointed the head of external consultancies at the Sir Lenny Henry Centre for Media Diversity. And I've also just been appointed chair of Ryder, the Royal Academy of Dramatic Arts. And I've spent 24 years at the BBC, last 8 years head of BBC Scotland Current Affairs programming during the referendum, and which, well, oversaw the referendum. The referendum wasn't 8 years long. And I then spent 3 years, or 4 years rather, in China, and 1 year last year in Malaysia, where I currently am, and I'm heading back to the UK in about a month's time. Okay, talking about freedom of speech. For me, diversity and freedom of speech are absolutely linked. They're inseparable. So let me explain why I think that. I fundamentally believe that diversity is a freedom of speech issue. So what you have is, if you look at diversity programs, diversity within the media industry, let's look at some of the stats. There's not a single major news program, from BBC Breakfast News, the Today program, Panorama, Dispatches on Channel 4, which is headed by a person of colour or a visibly disabled person, right? That is going to affect which stories they decide to pick and how they cover them, right? And it's not just news that's important. Drama impacts us on an emotional level. It enables us to walk in the shoes of another person and understand their reality in a way factual programs do not. There was a very good reason that during the McCarthy witch hunts, they went for drama directors and writers. Drama reframes how we see the world. Drama provides the narrative with which we understand the world. So if we want to understand our diverse neighbours, if we want to be a society at peace with itself and not trying to scapegoat one part of society or another, I believe that diversity through drama in many ways is even more important than diversity in our news. Right? So we need disabled people telling their stories so I can understand the world through their perspectives. I need women to have equal access to directing their own films so I can literally see the world through their eyes. And I want people of colour to create dramas and comedies so you can feel our joy and pain. All right, so here are a few stats. Right now in the industry that I love, if you look at film and TV, women make up just 13.6% of working film directors. Black and Asian people and minority ethnics make up 14% of England and Wales, make up just 2.2% of TV directors. And for disabled people working according to creative skill set employment census, only 0.3%, that's not even 1%, 0.3% of the total film workforce is disabled. Now, this has a massive knock-on effect for freedom of speech. Freedom of speech is meaningless if certain sections of society are disproportionately denied access to the platforms for their voices to be heard and stories to be told. Therefore, media representation that we commonly think of as diversity and inclusion is fundamentally a democracy and freedom of speech issue. You know, so I don't see it as being a side issue. I don't see diversity as being something which is a nice add-on. You cannot have democracy unless you've actually got diversity in your media industries, right? And so then this impacts with the idea that who actually decides, because we all know that even the strongest libertarian is not going to believe that we can have complete freedom of speech. There has to be some rules, some regulations, whether that's libel laws at the most extreme, right? But what we have to ask ourselves is, when we are deciding those rules, right, who do they impact most? Who do they disproportionately impact? Who has access to be able to navigate those rules, right? And finally, most importantly, who decides those rules? And again, that comes down to a diversity issue. To echo the speaker that went just before me, if you're going to look at pornography, right, and decide rules on pornography, no one would think in this day and age that it would be reasonable for the people that are deciding those rules to be 100% men, right? It would just be unrealistic. It would be untenable, right? Similarly, if we're going to look at the rules that decide what isn't possible and what can and cannot be said with regards to race hate, it would be absolutely untenable if those rules were 100% decided by white men, for example, right? And so diversity is, again, really important in actually deciding what those rules are and making sure that they are equitable and fair. So my argument is that there is no magic bullet, but we do need diversity in who makes those rules and then who actually implements those rules.
Thank you. Thanks very much. And Stefanie Boltzen from Die Welt.
Thank you. Is it on?
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, I'm Stefanie. I'm the UK and Ireland correspondent for Die Welt, which is a German broadsheet, probably more center-right broadsheet. I was based in Brussels before I came to the UK, so that was a big advantage in terms of the Brexit referendum, because I maybe understood a bit more than others what it meant to leave the European Union, because I had tried to understand it for 4 years, and I did understand it's rather complex, and leaving it will have rather complex consequences. I think you invited me a bit like being a kind of an insider and outsider at the same time. So I'm not now focusing on what the previous speakers have talked about, but more about my experience working in this country. So I'm a bit of an insider because I now finally have a lobby pass, so I do get access to certain information, but I'm a complete outsider when it comes to, for example, asking departments for interviews or getting any minister talking to me. Especially the Home Office is the most difficult department, I think, almost in the world. You can email them 10 times and you still don't get any answer or any access, unless you talk to someone like Brandon Lewis, and he actually wants to promote people signing up for the settled status program, and you put a policy paper in front of him and ask him, so people will be deported if they don't sign up, and he says yes. So that was a nice headline some 2 years ago. So sometimes the European media succeeds in creating headline. Actually, we've been quite successful. I work a lot with Antonello Guerrera from La Repubblica, and from time to time we manage to wind them up a bit, which is great. But again, usually as foreign media, they are not interested. Even charities tell you, well, you're not based in the UK, why should we waste our time talking to you, because you will not help us raising funds. So it can be, the experience here can be frustrating.
10 seconds.
10 seconds?
Yes. Oh no, beg your pardon, you're 5 minutes, aren't you?
Yeah.
Yes, sorry, sorry, my mistake.
I thought I still have a bit of a time feeling.
Yeah, 3 minutes.
So the role of European correspondents changed a little bit with the Brexit referendum, or more after the negotiations started in 2017. So we got interviews, we got a lot of access, obviously, to the Brexit department, and they were keen to talk to us, and the government tried to succeed getting some positive headlines back on the continent, which they were not very successful with. But it was, I mean, this has changed now because Brexit is over. We are back to that situation. The Foreign Press Association is increasingly doing a really good job in getting people talking to us. But talking about, we talked about this yesterday, Judith, as well, the situation of being trolled, or the situation of being attacked, and we all saw the Nick Watt video, which happened, I think, 3 days ago, just here around the corner. And that's something that's increasingly, worrying, the kind of aggression you encounter. And I think the UK media and other media as well, they contribute that to that themselves. And I find there's an increasing aggression also in the mainstream media, in the print media. You have the Guardian on the one side and the Telegraph the Daily Mail mostly, the Express anyway on the other side, and there's nothing in between. It's very difficult, I find, to find, at least in the printed press, to find some media that you can read without being agitated. It's a very agitated mood in this country, I find, and it, with GB News and also the Prime Minister's comments constantly. For example, recently, this row they made up at the G7 between Johnson and Macron that contributes to this heightened atmosphere. Looking a bit in the future, I'm really seeing some warning lights, especially with the Ofcom debate around Paul Dacre and the online safety bill. And who's going to decide what is harmful? Who's going to decide what stays and what is removed? And some stuff will not be removed because the government is interested in keeping this stuff on Facebook or wherever. And I do think, and I have a lot of friends, obviously, from Poland and Hungary, and also journalist friends from Poland and Hungary, who have basically resigned to government interventions into the freedom of the press, which in the end really harm democracy. And I think while this is a fantastic country and you have a fantastic press and you have amazing people, you still have the FT doing Wirecard story or the Guardian doing the Windrush story. But there's something, I have a kind of worrying feeling that because of the government you have, it is slowly but relentlessly being pushed to a side where the government will more and more determine what are the headlines and less the diversity and the democracy in this country.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so we now go round the table again, and I suggest we start again with Catherine, since that seems, hold on a sec, Catherine, I'm just changing camera position. There we go.
There we go. We zoom into focus. So thank you very much to the speakers. Some really interesting things there. And I'm going to have to apologize because I'm going to have to run very shortly to my next meeting. One of the things talking about Brexit that really was so frustrating during the Brexit debate was this idea that we had to have balance. That so you had information about what Brexit meant and all of that issue, and then they would wheel on somebody like Farage or Lawson who talk complete nonsense, and it was always the same. They weren't challenged. They weren't. The journalists didn't know enough about the European Union to challenge them, and that was frustrating. Doesn't happen when you have any other subject. You don't, when you're talking about health, you don't have, if we're talking about COVID, you don't have somebody who's wheeled on to talk about the masks are going to kill us, or they're going to inject chips into our arms and all the rest of it. So that's quite interesting. And I look back in history. I was an antique dealer, so I spent a lot of time looking backwards. But the parallels that we have now and the parallels with religion is quite interesting. It's when it's socially acceptable, it's fine to say that a woman gave birth as a virgin to a child, or that the God is three people and one of which is the son of that same person. And that's socially acceptable. And I know there's one person in this room that agrees with me that that's not the right answer to how we organize the world, but it's socially acceptable. And so even the most outrageous things are said and believed, and everybody said that's fine, and we'll go along with that. But for me, that's problematic. And it's a parallel that what we're seeing now is mistruths and disinformation. But we don't trust it, but some people out there do.
Thank you.
Yes, good point, Catherine. Right, well, I'm probably going to answer Lucy a little bit because I suppose I'm a bit of a champion of sort of anti-woke liberalism. And I've never agreed to no platform anybody. I never actually did do hustings with BNP, largely because Labour and the Tories were no platforming them, and then therefore the hustings never took place. But I always refused to no platform. Now, so I will always default towards free speech. Now, I do admit that it has some limitations, and I do agree that there is an issue with an age of majority and how to prevent younger people getting hold of material. But if we start along the lines of not allowing free speech, then I think we're on the slippery slope because the people who will be deciding what is allowable and what is not will generally be those in power. And so I will always default towards free speech, but I do agree that there are laws on hate speech, and I am not averse to those laws. I realise that sometimes those of us who are a little bit more robust, it gives us too much of an advantage because in certain cases, yes, you have to sort of respond in a sort of spirited manner to aggressive questioning and aggressive interviewing. But I think we must not start to look for too many limitations in free speech, because it will be used by those that we don't want to use that facility.
Thank you. And Richard Allan?
I think it's critical when we're looking at the speech. Oh, sorry, Richard Allan. I should just introduce myself again because we have new people. I'm a Lib Dem member of the House of Lords who spent a lot of time working in tech. I think it's critical to bear in mind two different concepts. One is speech as an absolute, and the other is reach, who your messages get to. I actually think in the European Union, there's a real reluctance for very good reasons, because we're all signatories to Article 10 of the European Convention to criminalize more speech. So the absolute of what you can say is not going to move very far. You can and always will be able to say COVID is a hoax, vaccines kill people. Those are not things that are going to be criminalized in any kind of Article 10 compliant regime. But what governments are trying to do more and more, and Stefanie referred to this, talking about Ofcom and the online safety bill, is regulate reach, which is it's much more subtle and more pervasive in a way to say, we're not going to stop you saying things, but we, the government, are going to give directions to our regulator Ofcom to say, you must prioritize this version over that version. So you can still say the thing, but no one's going to hear it. And it's that kind of work that's taking place. Again, another sort of concrete non-tech example is the Hungarian government's new measure, where the Hungarian government are not criminalizing people being supportive or producing LGBT material, but they are legally preventing its reach into schools, echoing something that the UK government did back in the 1980s and took us a long time to unravel. So let's think of this in terms of how comfortable we feel, or what we think the implications are of regulating reach, rather than absolute speech. And there I think we're going to get to the really big and important political questions.
Thank you. And Richard Reeves.
Thank you. I'm not going to make too much comment at this stage, because I think a lot of it will be covered in the third section, but I want to sort of highlight a couple of points that were made. In particular, obviously, when Lucy was speaking, I think there's a very clear call for us all to get behind reform of how social platforms rank and share content. I think that needs to be understood. In particular, it wasn't said in the first session, and I was delighted when it was in the second, because I didn't realise we wouldn't get more and more goes when Mike came around.
Yes.
But and that is representation, the point that Marcus made. I think even before fake news, narrative was very much skewed in a way that didn't represent the truth lived by multiple minorities. And I referenced it earlier, but at the event that we had, or the debate that we had within our member organisations, we had a speaker from Galdem, which is a publishing property that's been created by a very interesting character who founded a company called Brand Advance. And that is about creating publications to serve and represent those minorities and those opinions. And a stat that she presented that I found staggering, because I've seen a lot, but I've subsequently looked into it. She cited the fact that there is less than 0.2% of journalists here in the UK are black, and less than 0.4% are Muslim. So that is clearly a major part of the solution going forward.
Thank you. We now move to our Zoom friends, and I'm going to ask Nick Davies to kick off, and then I'll go to Kari Kivinen. So Nick, over to you. Oh, could you unmute?
I wasn't expecting you to come to me.
Oh,
Can we talk a bit about solutions, or is it too early for that?
No, it's too early for solutions, but are you going to have to leave?
No, I'm okay. Okay, but let me pick up on a couple of points there. I thought that what was said about the virgin who gives birth is really quite interesting, because in any era, there's a collection of ideas which can be expressed safely and without contradiction. And we can look back and see how very often those ideas are utterly crazy or unacceptable. You go back to the 1500s in this country, and burning women because the crops had failed was considered normal and unchallengeable. And there's a clue in there about how to approach the problem, which is that I think if you try and produce a rule that says, we don't like the following opinions, and so we're going to stop it in terms of speech or reach, you're in very, very dangerous country. But if you say instead, the kind of opinions that we really don't like are those which are attached to falsehood, then you've got a way through, because it is possible to tell the difference between what's true and what's false. And so I think I think the idea of wise people sitting in a dark room at the top of the Facebook hierarchy and trying to develop rules about what should be distributed is really the wrong place to start. They shouldn't be in a private room. It's our business, not theirs. And they're not going to come up with a rule which does the job without causing problems down the line. Come back to the basic underlying fact of truth and falsehood. And well, how to do that would take me into solutions, but I hope that's helpful.
Okay, thank you. And Kari, over to you.
So I would like to start with the positive approach. Internet and social media have given a voice to a lot of minorities, and also people in Belarus, Hungary, Poland, and Russia. So there is a positive side of using internet. The negative side, I agree with this reach thing. I am absolutely in voting for the liberty of expression, freedom of speech, but also looking at the responsibility of one's acts. And in the social media, this responsibility is very often fading. The internet providers know everything about us. They know our age, they know our interest. And if they want to cut the access to the unsuitable material, for example, porn for little children who are watching it in their phones, it's possible to do. It's technically absolutely possible to do if there is a will and interest to do it. I have this feeling that, once again, online and offline. On the offline world, we have good laws and good order. On the online world, we don't have it, or the laws are not really applicable, or the lawmaking processes or regulations are always late. So this is something to be discussed. If there is a will to prevent young people to see the porn, there are possibilities technically to do it. Yeah, but also that internet is a positive thing from the freedom of expression point of view.
Thank you. And just to reassure you, Marcus, main speakers get another chance to comment at the end of the round table. Over now to Alexandra.
Yes. Well, I tried to start also on positive notes. So I really enjoyed what Marcus said about the diversity and freedom of speech and expression. It's very basic. It's at the core of everything we should do in terms of promoting free and objective journalism. However, as I said, I'm Polish, and the problem is that the news-based and objective reporting is disappearing in Poland. It's going to be squeezed by the government and by the political party. And I see similarities to Great Britain during Brexit, because the problems for media become obvious when journalism becomes entangled in political struggle. In Poland now we have the policy of depolonization, meaning that the state-owned companies are buying even local press just to influence them on local level. So I think the line should be that we should return, well, this is the solution part of your event, but we should come back to the truthful, objective-based reporting and fact reporting in journalism, and not forming opinions. In my simple view, journalists should be there to transmit the facts and the news, and not to get entangled in political discourse and not to be machinery of political parties. So I saw the danger in the UK, and I see enormous danger now in Poland with this depolonization policy. Thank you.
Thank you. And then we come back into the room, and that's over to you, Evan. Do you have a microphone?
I do. I'm sorry, I can't be seen by those on Zoom.
You can.
I can I? Good, right. Yes. I'll smarten up. I was struck by what Marcus said about diversity, because it is the case that there is this underrepresentation that Richard mentioned of minorities in the press and media. And this was highlighted in the UK recently when the Society of Editors put out a statement denying that there was any problem of race in the media, and they had to retract it. And the Society of Editors is a lobby group for the newspapers, but the BBC is a member of it. And it seems quite happy, and I've engaged with the head of the BBC about this, quite happy for this organisation to speak on its behalf with talking nonsense and without checking with it, because there is fear by the BBC and other institutions of the power of the press. And as I say, it's not as bad as it is in some other countries, but if Paul Dacre, to take the point that was made by our German colleague, becomes chair of Ofcom, then you're putting, the vampire. Well, you're giving him the keys to the blood transfusion centre. It's crazy to have the most authoritarian, most anti-BBC, most partial person, but brilliant journalist, no doubt. But he's clearly not the right person to head Ofcom, and yet the government want Ofcom's appointments panel to look again. And I think it will become clear, without breaching too much privileged material, that the Daily Mail was a criminal organisation in the 1990s and 2000s, and probably later on than that. And so that will come back to bite them. Final point for me is this question of free speech. I'm not sure that Phil's right when he says that the only censor will be those in establishment, the power, those in power and establishment, in the conventional sense, because there is this problem of censorship by the mob, which is this oversensitivity and overreaction. I understand where it comes from, and until we have effective representation for racial minorities in the media, I don't blame those voices and others for feeling strongly about it. But is it right to penalize someone for something they said as a child in social media? I'm not sure it does. And my final point, I referred to the online hate bill, which was a Freudian slip earlier. It's the online harms bill or online safety bill. But that is going to restrict the freedom of speech of individuals who are underrepresented through their social media, while specifically excluding from that regulation and censorship the 5 tax-shy billionaires that own and run and dictate what's in 70% of our newspapers.
Thank you. And Marie?
Well, there's quite a lot to mop up there. First of all, I'd say the BBC is going through a bit of a revolution at the moment, and it's probably not the one you think it is, which is by moving so many news people out of London around the country. It's probably the big lesson we got from Brexit. It wasn't, the false equivalence, we didn't see Brexit coming. That's all true. But I think by moving people out around the country, about taking more apprentices rather than graduates, there will be a real change in what the staffing looks like, not just because we're out and about more, but also because people of my generation are all leaving because they don't want to move to Glasgow or Cardiff or whatever. So that's going to, I think that's going to create a lot more diversity. And that also has challenges, because I think one thing we haven't really dug into here is there's a huge generation gap, and it's slightly about, there's the culture wars, it's about, trolling or online. People's ideas of what impartiality is are changing so quickly. The older generations and younger generations, in the BBC, the idea of what's contested and what isn't, is moving, we're moving away from each other. It's fine, we've got, there's some nice easy ones, aren't there? Climate change, we go with the facts. Even politics, which I know people moan about, but actually we kind of know roughly how to do parliamentary, equality, people moan about it, but The real deep problem is things like, do we contest, you know, the whole argument around biology versus, you know, gender critical, you know, none of this. And people are very frightened to speak because it's, you know, it's harsh. It's a harsh environment. So until, you know, yes, we understand impartiality, independence, you know, bringing more diverse voices, but where is impartial? Where are we? It's a really muddy, noisy space, depending where you sit. And I think we're, you know, completely unresolved.
Thank you on that depressing note. Over to Irina.
Thank you. Allow me to speak with my lawyer's hat on for a moment. So I think we're looking at two things. One is the type of content, and the other one is who is responsible for it. So in type of content rather, I think we can differentiate firstly between criminal, which is determined by harm and is indeed defined by most legislators around the world. So what is criminal content, which is obviously dealt with under criminal legislation. And then we have facts, and facts are what we've been talking about, I think, in the first half, where it comes to fact checking and differentiating between truth and non-truth. And there, I think we have to be very careful with things such as deep fakes, because it's becoming obviously increasingly difficult to rely on things that were regarded as proved facts in the past. And that would also include sort of court evidence. And then finally, there is opinion. And opinion clearly needs to default to freedom of speech. This is the classical realm where, you know, if in any doubt, there has to be freedom of speech, even if we hate the opinion. So if we can focus on that differentiation when we talk about what is to be done. And then the second question is, who is responsible? And here I really do have a problem with this sort of two-faced opinion that says the social media platforms are to blame for all, you know, that is going wrong, and all the algorithms and the prioritization, etc., and they have to take responsibility as publishers. But on the other hand, what do is we empower them even more by renegating on all the democratic responsibility of elected people and pushing this responsibility and the censorship role, the gatekeeper role, to the social media platform. So they now are supposed to tell what is and what isn't hate speech, what is and what isn't criminal content. And whereas this is really the task of the legislator, or indeed of an independent body that is answerable only to elected officials. Thank you.
Thank you. We will now go back to our lead speakers for their comments. And you're on the similar sort of 1 to 2 minutes. Thank you. So Lucy.
Thank you. So I did want to pick up what Phil was saying, not very surprisingly. But I want to come back and say that I do think that reach is what is really important here, that actually free speech, there are rules around free speech. Those rules have been around for a long time. Probably they're reasonably good. The issue is that within those free speech rules, the current system is driving more and more and more content to more and more and more extreme places. It's not that we don't want ever to have, some people will want to have access to violent pornography. It should not be the case that young men these days think that violent sex is the norm. And that is what's becoming the case. And that's what young women are having to deal with. And we shouldn't pretend that that's not the case, and that's a real problem. And that's where we come back to some of the discussion that there was earlier about the difficulty of which version we want, and whether, I mean, once you start saying what should the reach be, you have to start coming into the conversation about this version is better than that version. And in the case of kind of violent pornography, maybe that's a relatively easy one. I mean, there are, of course, there will be people around there who want to do that, and that they have a perfect right as adults to do that. I do not want my teenage daughters to be in a world where all the boys that they meet think that that's what normal is like. That gets much more complicated when you start talking about other issues, and race is one of those, trans issues, as you say, another really difficult one. And that's where I think we have to come back to what Marcus was saying about who makes the regulations and who is in there deciding. I mean, I think it's just, you can't just say that there is no version of the world that is not better or worse than another one. There are some things in society which are good for society, and there are some things which are less good for society, and we need to recognise that. And some of that is about protecting minorities, protecting the weak and vulnerable. And that means that those people have to be in the conversation about who is setting that agenda and about the regulation. So I think the stuff that Marcus was talking about diversity within the regulation is really critical.
Okay, thank you. So Marcus, we come to you now for your answer, if you like. Could I throw you a question? I haven't done this so far, but you wrote a very interesting blog post not that long ago about Twitter censorship of the debate around the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And if you could reference that, I'd be very grateful. Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
Over to you.
All right, so what you have with Twitter is that there is a group of people that we do not know what their diversity is. We do not know where they are based. We do not know what their makeup is at all, who are deciding which hashtags to prioritize, which hashtags to demote, deciding that there are certain terms that they don't think are acceptable, right? And we only often come across these things when something has gone wrong. So it's happening all the time. And there were a few cases with regards to the recent Palestine conflict where these things bubbled up into the news, but they would never come up in the news unless there was a quote unquote mistake, which Twitter then admitted, right? And then corrected. Right, so what I would say is that we cannot live in a world that is completely free of censorship. There's no such thing. There's no binary world of free speech world versus non-free speech world. Everything is relative and everything is on a continuum. There'll always be some form of censorship and some form of regulation. But what we need is, which Twitter does not have, and which I was pointing to in my blog piece, is that we need consistency and we need transparency. We need to have transparency with regards to the algorithms, and so that we understand what's going into the algorithms and what isn't going into the algorithms. We need transparency as to who are the decision makers, so we can actually decide whether we agree or don't agree with the decision makers. And once we have that transparency, we need to have consistency so that we can ensure that the same regulations which are applying to women are also applying to men, and vice versa, and all different types of groups. So that's what I think we should be aiming for. We should be aiming for transparency and consistency.
Thank you very much. And Stefanie, over to you.
I mean, I admit there are so many thoughts now flying through my head. I don't know where I should really pick up.
Hang on a sec. Yeah. Gentleman at the back. Gentleman at the back. Robert, Christopher, we can hear you. That's okay. Thank you.
Yeah, I just briefly, very briefly, picking up Marcus' point on diversity. I might be wrong. I just tried to pick up the numbers in Germany, but I think still, in comparison to continental Europe, the British media is far more diverse than any other European media, and especially in Germany, that's of course a challenge because of the arrival of more than 1 million refugees since 2015. It is getting better, but I think especially the BBC. I mean, this morning I think we had Amol Rajan and Michal Hussein hosting the Today program. I think, of course, there is a lot of improvement needed, but in the European context, I really think British media is really very advanced and far more aware of how much diversity is needed, and also in the context of how you reach and how you get audiences. If you don't do that and people do not feel represented, you can't reach them anymore and they're gone. So I think especially migrant communities from Southeast Asia in general, they don't watch the BBC anymore. They because they have satellites, because you have the internet, they watch what they get from their home countries. And of course, this is very dangerous because they will get a perspective on the world that is in many cases not the one that we need here to keep our democracy going. And just one point I want to make in terms of bias. I mean, if you think the European media was very neutral about reporting about Brexit, certainly wasn't. I mean, I think there's a lot of self-criticism to be done how we reported on Brexit, and that we often made it far too much our own personal convictions, and that we felt kind of sulking that how could the Brits ever leave our clubs? That's outrageous. And I think we often failed in catching the reasons why this happened. And I do see this, I mean, I'm really trying hard to stay neutral on this. But I see it in the comments when I write about Boris Johnson or about Brexit. Mainly I get harsh attacks by our readers because they say, you don't like Boris Johnson and you don't like Brexit. And they love Brexit and they love Boris Johnson. So don't underestimate how popular Brexit and Boris Johnson is on the other side of the channel.
Thank you. We've done well on time, so I'm going to, I think we've got time for about 5 more comments. So do raise your hand if you would like to go on the list. Okay,
yeah.
Phil.
Okay, I just wanted to make a point about, I think you started to make the point about South Asian particularly, the South Asian diaspora here, is that they not only watch channels from their home countries. I mean, if you remember, the Bangladeshi chef made the joke when she was on television about having to watch Bangladeshi television in her house, and it was appalling. But we also have a huge homegrown diaspora media. I mean, over the years, I've done far more interviews, TV and radio, on South Asian media based in this country than I have on the mainstream media. I mean, Nor TV broadcasts worldwide from a terraced house in Aston, in Birmingham, and they are full-time journalists, but they're probably not featuring in the figures, and I think it's something to remember. I mean, it's particularly the South Asian diaspora, but I wouldn't rule out that other diaspora are doing some of that, but not nearly to the same extent.
Okay, thank you. Richard Allan. And Shaffaq has just joined us. So Shaff, we will come to you after Richard if you have something to say.
So, I just reacting to Nick's comment a little while ago about truth and falsehood. I think it came up a couple of other times. Truth and falsehood being a measure for sort of differentiating how you should treat different content. And that was something that feels attractive, but in practice can be really tough. This line between opinion and a sort of alleged factual statement can be really, really hard to draw when you're dealing with individual content items. So it's attractive, but really hard. And I would note as well, it used to be, say, when you work in social media, people come to you and say, why don't you have rules banning lying? But a society doesn't ban lying except in very, very narrow circumstances, and that's libel, lying with intent to harm somebody, or fraud, but normal lying is not, as far as I'm aware, criminalized in any kind of democratic system. So we've got this sort of gap between the law, which tends not to criminalize lying, except in these narrow circumstances, and then the rules on platforms, potentially where people are saying you should get rid of lying, and then this question of, as I say, a spectrum. So the Daily Mail, as example, always comes up. The Daily Mail has a lot of articles, which are news articles, which are based on facts, but people often feel are quite troubling because of the way they use those facts and the way they advance them. So again, this sort of, it's really hard to find a sort of neat line you'd love to find to say, look, we'll just deprecate all of the untruthful content and promote all of the truthful content. In practice, you're still left making these judgment calls, like, is this individual Daily Mail article truthful? Does it truthful enough or false enough to fall on one side of the line or the other?
Thank you. And Shaffaq, if you could introduce yourself, Shaff, and then you've got 2 minutes.
Okay, my name's Shaffaq Mohammed. I'm from Sheffield. I'm a former colleague of Judith and Phil and Irina and Catherine and all the other Lib Dem MEPs. So I represent the Yorkshire Humber region. I'm a city councillor in Sheffield, and apologies, I had to disappear. Something had cropped up in Richard and all this, Ecclesall Woods, crossing Abbey Lane, so I had to go there with officers. So in terms of media and truth, I mean, clearly we can look at ourselves here in the UK, but I want to look at the more global sense, and in particular, comparing the actions of, well, the world's biggest democracy, but also the most populous state that sits side by side, and the similarities between them. So you know, how press freedoms are often curtailed, particularly when it comes to the Uyghur community in China, where, let's be honest, whenever a Western press turn up, they're usually hounded out of town or tailed all the way through. And we've got to challenge that. And often it's difficult to do that formally, to film stuff. So often it's left to activists to get footage. Similarly, you know, across the border in India, the government loves you to film the stuff it wants to, but it doesn't want you to report negativity. And we've seen that very much with this COVID issue, where Western journalists have been criticised by the national media for, why they're highlighting the problems our country is facing. And we've got to challenge that to say, well, because there are problems in your country with lack of oxygen, lack of preparation, etc. And similarly, my biggest worry is in both these countries, and I'm sure elsewhere, is that these internet lockdowns that stop information from various regions getting out. I mean, a good example has been Kashmir, when they changed the autonomy of the region, and basically they followed that with basically locking everybody down and arresting all political prisoners and etc. And it was near impossible to get any information out of there. So we've got huge challenges, not only in our own country. We've got an interesting new satellite TV channel with its own slant on the news. Let's see how that goes. It's had a few glitches. But the realities are that we can't rely upon Facebook to be the policeman, because there's other avenues. WhatsApp's there, misinformation can be spread, and it's a real difficult one. I think I heard Richard
10 seconds
talking about the issues that basically the same arguments have been made by Russia and I think by India. I think Richard said, and absolutely, and I don't think it can be left to tech giants like Facebook and Google and others to be the arbiters of news. We've got to kind of challenge fake news, and there's a lot of it around, and unfortunately we had a lot of it in 2016 in June. I'll leave it at that.
I'm going to draw you to a close. Thank you. So thank you, everyone. Now 5 minutes, and then we will be back to do the third topic, what can be done, starting off with Kari Kivinen, with contributions from Richard Allan and Richard Reeves. Hello, hello. I now call this meeting to order for the third topic, what can be done. We've touched on this a little, but now let's address it head on. Kari Kivinen is a former Secretary General of the European School System. Kari, we're going to try some screen sharing, I believe. Fantastic.
Okay. What to do? Faktabar is a Finnish fact-checking organization, and already 4 years ago we noticed that fact-checking is always coming too late. It's after something has already said and written, and the wrong information, disinformation has been spread. So we decided to go for education, and the idea was to adapt the fact-checking methods to the school environment. We did it in Finland. And we have these 4 statements which are valid all over. We have been in a lot of seminars all over the world. Digital information literacy should be included in the national curriculum. Teachers should be trained, and they should have tools and methods to deal with information disorder. And schools should provide students with digital information literacy skills and critical thinking skills. And the interaction between the specialists, journalists, media experts, fact checkers with the schools and teachers would be welcomed. So we have done this. We have kind of supported teachers inside of the Finnish curriculum to deal with social media issues in the classroom context. We have empowered students with critical thinking and digital information skills to resist mis and disinformation, and we have activated students to verify their social media content. I already spoke about the new challenge, which is how to find information from the library, which is a very well organized, where the information is really at its place, to the world where the search engines are based on the algorithms, and they are giving millions of hits. And for example, if I would be a site looking for information about camel, I would be first guided to British rock band, secondly camel tobacco, and third Amazon camel.com site. There is a huge difference on text in online environments and offline environments. We have learned to read the traditional way, but we should be learning the new skills, how to handle the information coming in the online environments. Because the platforms, they are made and they are designed to commercial interest, to capture our attention, to monetize our data, and to predict and influence our behavior. They know a lot about us. And this leads in many cases to the extremism and spread of disinformation. There are, according to latest research, this is coming from Max Planck Institute, Kosurava, I'm working with her in a project, and there are, according to their opinion, 4 entry points to handle it. Policymakers, law and ethics, regulations, technology, the big platforms, they can use the same algorithms to do something good than they do to get maximum profit for their company. And also the science. There is very little studies made about the psychological and social effects on behavioral and cognitive behavior in the online environments. And then education, and I'm going to speak about this education. School curricula should include digital information literacy. What is this digital information literacy? It can be defined as a set of skills and abilities which everybody needs to undertake information-related tasks. How to discover, access, interpret, analyze, manage, create, communicate, store, and share information in the digital environment. There has to be on somewhere behind ability to think critically and to make balanced judgments. And this is something where the education comes in. And this is very crucial from the democracy point of view, because if people are not able to find correct information, they are not able to be critical citizens or informed citizens. Finland has been leading all the media literacy rankings for many years. Our government has produced Finnish media education leaflet. It can be downloaded. And our curriculum is really well made, I have to say it. I've been working 30 years abroad, so I can praise Finnish curricula. Because we call it multiliteracy in Finland, which means media and information literacy. It's something starting from early education, going through the whole school curricula. Also, the thinking and learning to learn is very important part. But we have noticed very recently that this is not enough. And in fact, we are at this very moment revising the instructions for teachers concerning the information management. And we are kind of creating this kind of new reading skills information. So it starts with very early education, and there is a systematic kind of structure where we are teaching children how to cope online environment complications. We are also very much teaching and trying to create opportunities for students to learn the critical thinking. And we in the curriculum, it's in a very crucial part, so that the pupils are able to clarify unclear information. They are able to recognize and evaluate different arguments coming from different sources, and they are able to cope with differences. But we have noticed that teacher training is needed. Teachers who have got their education far beyond the internet was developed and before the handhelds were coming into market, they are kind of feeling unsure how to deal with these things. And in Faktabari Edu, we have been organizing a lot of teacher trainings. We have written guidebooks for teachers. We support the national curriculum by doing kind of extra activities for the teachers. According to our point of view, in the digital information literacy toolkit, we should have different elements. And it's not only reading. There is the understanding the difference between online and offline environments. the difference between the media scenes of students and their teachers and parents, interaction with the experts. Science is more than opinion, which sources are reliable, how to classify misleading information, how to deal with confusing content, and algorithm literacy or awareness, how to verify the authenticity of photos and videos, and the last but not least, how to take care of the privacy and digital footprint.
10 seconds, Kari.
Okay, 2 ideas. We have noticed that there is so much information in the world that we should not spend our limited attention span to the rubbish. So we are kind of promoting strategic ignoring strategy. So there is so much rubbish we can put away and go straight to the point. And then lateral reading is that traditionally we are going to the text, we are analyzing the text, and we are sometimes spending a lot of time and energy on analyzing something which is totally biased. So the online traffic rules for online environments is check first who is behind the information, what is the evidence, and what does the other sources say. I stop here.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. And let's sort out the screen. There we go. And now over to Richard Allan, from the European Digital Media Observatory.
Thanks very much. Just to start with a bit of history, the European Union institutionally started getting engaged in the disinformation subject sort of 2018, when everybody else was also getting excited about this after the events of 2016 and 2017 sunk in. That was obviously at the end of that cycle, and so there was no scope for the EU to legislate. The EU needs 3 to 5 years anyway, as people who have been MEPs will recognise. So there's no way that the EU was going to sort of pass any kind of legislation on disinformation. There's also a really interesting kind of healthy, I think, skepticism about legislating in this space in the EU, particularly driven by people like Commissioner Vera Jourova, who is leading on this, because she grew up in a state where the government controlled the media landscape. And so particularly from, as I say, those who come from territories that were formerly run by communist regimes, there's a sort of innate skepticism and a concern about rushing to legislate. So as a result, the EU came up with a code of practice, which is a self-regulatory instrument, both out of necessity, no time to legislate, and desire, as a sort of wish to go carefully in this area. That may end up getting superseded to a certain extent by this Digital Services Act, which is a key instrument in this new 2019-2024 legislative cycle. But even in the Digital Services Act, I think it's actually holding back a little compared with the UK legislation in proposing more of a co-regulatory model rather than the EU sort of rushing into this space. Whereas if you look at the UK Online Safety Bill, I think the British government are much more keen to be directive and use Ofcom to tell social media companies what they should or shouldn't allow, which itself is very interesting. We'll see how that survives. But anyway, as part of all of that, the sort of self-regulatory landscape, that a small amount of European Commission funding was directed towards setting up this thing called the European Digital Media Observatory. I'm on it as a volunteer. Arguably, I'm doing some of my penance for having spent time at Facebook is to give back by trying to deal with some of the European responses to disinformation. It's run by the European University Institute. It has a small secretariat there and a group of interested people. And it does what I think the EU does in the internet space really well, because you get a lot of value for money, which is pull together networks of people working in the same area. So there are long-standing networks working things like child safety, where all the different national child safety experts get together in a EU forum or EU-sponsored forum. We're doing the same. A lot of our work is doing the same in 2 areas. One is fact-checking. So we have a forum, a space, and some tools for fact-checkers across the EU. So that brings them together and I think adds some value, because a lot of what they're doing is very common. And we're also doing it for media literacy organizations. It's a space where media literacy organizations can engage with each other within the banner of this EDMO. And then the third area, which is the one I'm mainly spending my time on, is around research. And there are 2 pillars to that. One is pulling together all the research that's being done. And frankly, Kari cited some of it in his slides, but frankly, there's a lot we still don't know, and really fundamental questions. For example, you know, when you think about something like anti-vax misinformation, one hypothesis is an individual goes online, sees one piece of anti-vax information and cancels their vaccination appointment because it's persuaded them like to go off. The other hypothesis is, look, people see this stuff, but they know it's all bullshit and they don't really care. And the people who are not going to get a vaccination anyway don't change their minds, but neither do the people who are going to get vaccinations. And if it's the second one of those, we're in a very different space. It's like, in a sense, it's a much less serious problem than if we're in the first one. And the only way we can really understand this is through research. And people like Reuters Institute and others are doing the research that we need, and there's lots of institutions, and there's a Danish academic who's leading this for us, trying to get together one corpus of research so we can have evidence-based policy making, because we actually understand, you know, what the real world effects of misinformation are. And then the bit within that I'm working on is getting data out of the platform. So people raise questions around algorithms and things today. So getting the data from the platforms to the researchers, which is much more complicated than people think. And if I say the words Cambridge Analytica, I hope people will understand that. Cambridge Analytica was associated with apparently a research organization at the University of Cambridge who wanted data for research. And we kind of all know what happened from that. So it is not as simple as saying, look, I'm a good researcher, platform, just give me your data, it'll be fine. No. And particularly since the GDPR is in force, we need a proper legal framework where everybody is protected. The platforms are protected if they hand the data over. The researchers are protected for using the data because it's often sensitive and political, and everybody's protected. So I'm working with some others to create a working group where we try and work through all those data protection questions to enable a lot more sharing between platforms and researchers in Europe, so we can answer some of these fundamental questions. So that's what we're doing. We've got a little bit of funding to do this. As I say, it's quite a lean organization, but it's really networking people working on disinformation in the European Union and trying to produce really good qualitative research and tools that allow people to understand the phenomenon, and in particular then craft, you know, good policy responses to it. So something like the eventual shape of the Digital Services Act,
10 seconds.
we hope will be informed by some of the work that we're able to do. So that's Edbo.
Thank you. Thanks very much. And over to Richard Reeves of the, and I'll remind you, CEO for the Association of Online Publishers.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I'm not qualified to talk to any of the politics here. So what I'm going to briefly try and share is my observations, what I believe is, if you like, is a snapshot of, excuse me, considerations I know publishers to be taking towards, you know, effectively trying to find a resolution to this problem. Some do think there is a simple answer to the problem already, and that's letting audiences define quality for themselves. And by this, I mean effectively laying out clear details about media sources and credibility. The thought being that publishers can empower readers to make informed decisions about truthfulness, and the way that is done is by adopting some of these fact-check offerings such as NewsGuard, Trust Project, which is effectively applying a third-party labeling that acts on an independent sort of, if you like, nutritional label for the web content type idea, and it includes social. One really interesting sort of insight for me certainly was the British Medical Journal, the BMJ, which is, as many of you I'm sure are aware, effectively operates behind a paywall, providing content for its subscribing professional medical practitioners. But they were alarmed, if you like, by the ever-changing situation and disinformation around the coronavirus situation. And so they made an open decision to remove that paywall to provide access to people to be able to get access to the facts. But what they do also do within that is they openly state where there may be room for debate around information provided, and whether content is peer reviewed. So in other words, show their workings. But we touched on this earlier, as well as helping readers tell fact from fiction. Addressing, if you like, this disconnection will mean tackling the other key issue, which is underrepresentation. When it comes to trust, this need is particularly great as the dominance of certain voices, as we've seen over time. Many of these voices means that stories simply don't resonate with a broad range of audiences. What's required really is further industry-wide effort to give representation for different communities. Although specialist publications are critical, we must strive, if you like, for a world where dedicated and major titles both deliver diverse perspectives. Like any complex challenge, there isn't one quick and easy fix. Improving trust and truth is going to call for higher transparency and accountability, which has obviously been touched on a lot today, at multiple levels. And it's not easy, always easy, to walk the fine line between producing content that's generally popular and upholding responsible standards. But aiming for an even balance is paramount. I think we all feel that now going forward. And doing so starts with acknowledging, and I think this is something that I've heard from some of the speakers in the room, my colleague opposite me in particular, which is acknowledging the issue with our own bubbles and the need to inspect that. Secondly, I think publications must embrace their capacity to become the change makers. We provide informed media, we have engaged audiences, and we have the ability to lead as the change makers. And by that, I'm suggesting ideas that I know some news gatherers are considering, which is, raising that bar on internal practices. That goes a long way, greater transparency around how you bring those stories, but also fostering real change, whether that's the idea of small steps, such as following 10 outlets with opposing views, through to understanding other opinions, or if you like, as I suggested earlier, joining the movement for the push to a reform on how social platforms rank and share content. That, it is their secret source, it's their secret box. You've touched on some very good reasons why that data is protected under GDPR, but equally, it seems so ridiculous sometimes, and in the other commercial world that we all operate in as publishers, there are some absolute ridiculous elements where a machine makes a decision and there is no human intervention, and that's a real problem.
Thank you. That's perfect. We're just making sure our screen continues to work. Because oh, I could do that. How about that? That's a good idea. I'll change the... Sorry, we're being threatened with the TV going on to standby for those of you on Zoom. Isabel, could you... I've just changed the view. So I'm going to come to the people on Zoom first to comment now. We're going round the room. Are you prepared? Are you happy to receive? Yep. Okay, so Nick, if you would like to begin. We can't, oh, you're going to have to go back to the beginning and unmute yourself.
Oh, that's my fault. The first thing is that I think that the Finnish approach, as we have just heard 10 minutes ago, is really interesting and important and helpful, and that we should leave the meeting today adopting that as an agenda. He's really onto something important. If I could add something to that, one single thing that I think is as important is that we have to repair the broken business model of mainstream news. It doesn't matter whether you finally get an honest regulator. It doesn't matter if you have internal ethics and high bars and all the rest of it. That right now, as we've entered this age of information chaos, we need a body of people who have the resources and the skills to go out and tell you what's true and what's false. It may be difficult, Richard, but that's the aim. And the money has been taken out of that by the internet. And it's not just an optional extra. It is crucial, as important as the stuff that Kari's talking about, that we put the mainstream media back into a position where it can do its job. So I'd like that to be right up at the top of the agenda, along with the Finnish approach. If you had a world in which those two things were up and running, you'd have a world in which truth was starting to win the battle against falsehood.
Thank you. Thanks very much. And now, Shaffaq, if you're still with us, you were there a moment ago. Yes.
I'm still here.
Super.
Yeah, I mean, interesting. We talked a lot about online, but also there's some international players. I mean, RT News is probably the main one, but there's lots of others. The Chinese state news channel. A lot of them are doing English language. And that's not for the domestic audience. That is to influence Western societies and other English-speaking societies. And what we're seeing is that others are trying to follow. I've seen content now produced by Turkey, and they have their particular slant on things. So it's not only kind of issues we have of disinformation / fake news on the internet, we also have it in terms of broadcast. And in terms of the EU, I think the EU Disinformation Lab has done some fantastic work over the last couple of years on unearthing, let's be honest, quite frankly, I would say, fronts of deep states, of, you know, foreign countries trying to influence in the, you know, politicians in the European Parliament, politicians in America, UK, with various branding of newspapers that have not existed for decades. So there's a real problem of getting to the bottom of these places. And often they're very amateurish enterprises as well that have been exposed to all, you know, a dozen, 2 dozen of these so-called publications, all originating from one website, one address in a particular capital or elsewhere. So there's a lot of stuff out there that's being targeted towards us in the West to influence our policymakers, our decision makers, whether it's in Westminster, whether it's in Brussels, Strasbourg, or in Washington, in Capitol Hill, in terms of their kind of reactions towards different countries and their relationships. I'll leave it at that. I think I've run out of time, Judith. Sorry.
Okay, thank you. Thanks very much. And now, Alexandra.
Thank you, Judith. Well, me too. I adore the Finnish model. I think that there are many takeaways, also how to regain trust in media and democracy, speaking about my home country. But for our discussion, 4 takeaways, I think crucial is empowering civil society to identify and expose disinformation. Also create independent regulatory body, but a body that can facilitate the work of fact checkers, but by investing in content and promoting the fact-checking platforms. And last but not least, I think organizing events like that and raising awareness on a wider stage about the negative effects of disinformation, fact threats, and you know, freedom of speech. So the more we talk about that, the more we raise awareness about the negative impacts of disinformation, the more we will be able to come with solutions to it. That's it from my side. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Evan, could we pick up with you?
Yeah, I just have a couple of thoughts on what's been said. Those were 3 very interesting presentations, and I certainly agree with what's been said about them. In terms of research, one of the things that I want to just reiterate is the importance of understanding survey evidence, okay? So Reuters, for example, great organization, no doubt, but they shouldn't, as they did, produce a survey and publish it saying that the trust in the media is 52%. Not only is it meaningless, it's misleading, it's misinformation, because you have to stratify it by broadcast media, you have to stratify it by printed press, and then you've got to stratify it by social media, and then you've got to ask, what's the reach of each of those if you want to have a meaningful figure that's trackable over time or comparable between countries on trust in the media and what the problem is. That's not the only metric. It's no good me pronouncing on whether I have much trust in Sky News if I don't watch it. So again, it's got to be you've got to drill down, and they've been very sloppy, and it really annoyed me. And they were BBC defensive, if I can use that term. We never do anything wrong when we raised it, but clearly their headline on some study was wrong. However, the data is there, and it's very important. And so when Stefanie made the point about how the UK media is more diverse than, citing Michal Hussein and Amal Rajan, that is broadcast. It's the BBC, and it's broadcast. It's not, as Marcus has pointed out, it's not the UK media, it's UK broadcast has oases of good practice in that respect. That's important to say. And I finally want to just come back to this point about the need to, the reason why the presentation we have from Kari is so important is that I don't think realistically you'll ever be able to sort this problem by censorship. I think that's generally been accepted. So for example, when it comes to violent pornography, the starting point has to be, they're going to see this stuff. Let's have effective sex education in schools, which we don't have. And we still have. There was a case the other day, the government finally lost in the court because some school, some Catholic school, had been teaching, as they're allowed to in this country, because we're still a religious country, it seems, that men must take the lead in sex. I mean, you know, and women must be submissive in schools, in this country, in 2021, right? Absurd. So until we get effective education, both in terms of critical thinking and in terms of media and digital literacy, and in terms of safety, then you're going to be fighting a losing battle, because I don't think you'll ever put the internet genie fully back at. I'm not saying it's only one approach, but you need to start and end with education and effective education. I know you agree with that. I'm just saying that has to be stressed more.
Thank you. Thanks, Evan. And Marie.
I would like to defend the Reuters survey. I watch it I look at it every year, and they do exactly that. They dig down to all the countries, all the different platforms, not on the headline. There we have it. That we're back to the grubby issue of amplification of poor. But the actual research is excellent. Anyway, sorry, can that not count as my minute?
Yes, okay. And we're near the end, I'll let you off that bit.
So first of all, like everyone else, the BBC workshops look very similar to the Finnish workshops. And the brilliant thing about the Finnish workshops is it's on the curriculum, and that's exactly what's needed. You know, we have all these marvelous schemes, you know, we're hearing about things that you're doing, you know, one place, another. Really, until you have a critical mass and people work together, they're pinpricks. Until in the UK, it's the Department of Education dealing with it, not culture and media, then, you know, we're not going to make enough progress. The BBC can go into classrooms all day, every day, and we're not going to do the same thing as the Finns. And we know it works, because in Finland, we know they have much lower rates of being misled by misinformation. So it's fabulous to know that. So in terms of what else we do, I mean, the BBC is doing things it never used to do, which is it partners. I mean, you know, we're working on something called the Trusted News Initiative, which means although our journalists are busy holding platforms to account, corporately, we are working with the platforms to try and find ways of working together. You know, in terms of how do we red flag harmful misinformation, there has to be a bar from spreading. We're looking at how we can create training programs globally for journalists in parts of the world with, you know, much, you know, lower, what's the word, really, with lower training, who lack verification skills, all the things, the new modern skills that you need. Teaching everyone to think like journalists or think like fact checkers, thinking differently. We still teach children, we still, as adults, we're thinking analog, we're not thinking digitally. And so, you know, education and the way we work is pretty old-fashioned, and the BBC is trying to be part of the new digital world. We know that our content that goes out on the 10 o'clock news, fine, everyone knows it's the BBC, it's pretty trusted. Most of our content globally now is, you know, increasingly going out on social media platforms we have no control over. How do we, you know, is our brand even on the content we create nowadays? We don't know. We struggle with that. We need people to understand, A, that we create trusted news, and B, that they recognize it when they see it. And so a lot of work we're putting into globally is how do we work with algorithms, social media platforms and partners around the world, so that there's a greater understanding of not just the BBC, but other trusted broadcasters and publishers, so that people understand trusted news when they see it.
Thank you. Thanks very much. And Irina, if you would.
Thank you. Yes, I just want, I mean, I obviously very much agree with what Kari was saying about education. It was a really impressive presentation. Thank you for that. And I think this is also going to be at the heart of the Liberal Democrat policy paper that we are in the process of drafting. But I wanted to pick up on one other point, which Richard, I believe, made, and that is on echo chambers, because it is very, very important. I think we all fall into that trap. I certainly can speak for myself, that we increasingly become polarized because our own information bias is reinforced through the echo chambers that we move in on social media and elsewhere, you know, not least in these fora. And I think we mustn't forget that these echo chambers are reinforced through algorithms by the social media platforms. And this is where actually social media platforms do have an editorial role that they play today. And I think regulation needs to take that into account, make those algorithms more transparent so that we understand why we are getting certain content fed to us and not other content. And to counteract that, apart from media literacy, as you rightly say, we need to actually make an effort to seek different opinions, which I think people don't do anymore because of information bias and because we don't really want to hear uncomfortable truths. Thank you.
Thanks very much. And Stefanie, if you would like to take the microphone.
Just very briefly picking up the point on trust in media. We, thanks, so to say, to the COVID pandemic, have never sold so many subscriptions. And this is the experience of mainstream media in the pandemic, that people were really looking for what they still thought. So they actually returned to reading established mainstream media because they thought, I'm sitting at home, I'm really worried and nervous. And who do they turn to? The established media that was for such a long time the devil in the room. But I thought it was very interesting, the points that Richard was making on what is now the evidence we will base future legislation on. And we talked a little bit about the case of Germany, where they tried to introduce this law, but as far as I can follow it, it hasn't really got a grip of the problem of how you stop misinformation distributed via platforms. We recently introduced, which is just an interesting experience, only people who have a subscription with Die Welt can comment. And this has, I mean, you can, of course, it's controversial, so why shouldn't not everyone comment on what we're writing? But the level of discussion is so much better now. Probably also because the bots don't come through, but also because, especially with Brexit, I must say, in the last month since we introduced that, I really enjoy reading the comments because people, not all of them, of course, but a lot of people have a very educated, very mature debate now on our side. So
that gives you heart. Thank you. And Lucy?
Thank you. So thank you very much. They were all very interesting presentations. On education, my pre-politics life was as a teacher. I do want to say that I think that putting all the hope of solving this onto schools and educators is not going to work. I'm really sorry, but a couple of lessons. I mean, my goodness, we need better sex education, but a couple of hours in school is not going to make up for all the stuff that people see on the internet. And while I'm really glad to hear that what's working, that what is going on in Finland has an impact, I suspect that there are a whole range of reasons why things are better in Finland and that it's not just about what happens in school. And I don't think that we should feel that, I mean, it is really important that young people are better educated and helped to understand about misinformation and disinformation. But I think we need to really think of this as a much wider problem. That's part of the solution, but it seems to me that it's only a relatively small part of the solution, not least because most people are not in school anymore. Most people have finished with school, and we need to recognise that this is a whole society issue, which is why I think in the end, we've got to come back to regulation as part of the solution to this problem. But I absolutely recognise that it's very, very difficult, and it's very good to hear about the research that's going on into trying to understand what the impact of all of this is. The final point I wanted to make was about the BBC, which is to say thank you very much for the local democracy reporters. I think local journalism is actually really important and is was one of the first places that disappeared, where good journalism disappeared, was in local reporting. It's much more difficult to lie to people about what's going on in the place where they live because they can tell and they can see and they talk to their neighbours. So actually getting that local level and local reporting back has been really valuable and useful. And I think that that's an area which perhaps we should have touched on more, but I do think it's really been helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much. And Phil.
Yes, I was going to start with education as well, and I think it was quite an interesting presentation. But as Lucy says, this is a whole society issue, and relying entirely on education, it's going to be a very, very, very long burn. Probably two generations, by which time things will have moved on a huge amount. But it's still a necessary part. I mean, as a history student, the first thing I studied was historiography, which is basically critical analysis of your source material. And so there's plenty of history, if you like, of this kind of education, and I think it's absolutely necessary. On the second point, I was going to say something about what Irina said, because that was going to be my second point, is the diversity. People actually exist in their own media silos to a large extent, and it's a question of where you get this sort of trust and where you find it, and does it now have to be on an international level rather than a national level? Because basically, if you know, if there's any subject you know a lot about and you see it reported in the press, they always get it wrong. Even the top quality media will not get it quite right if it's something that you know a lot about, and that must be the same for everybody. So they're not quite, because truth is actually quite complex. And so that is going to be an extremely difficult job to try and sort of adjudicate on what's true and what is not true. And it's probably going to be ineffective if it's done in the silos of nation states. So I think that's another point. If it's going to be done at all, it needs to be done at international level and independently. And I think that's going to be a huge project, and it may well never get off the ground. So that's a bit depressing, yes. But then the last thing was possibly we might well see a cultural change. I think Richard sort of suggested we could start seeing some sort of cultural change within the media industry itself. But I think all three of those, I would say, we've got to look at some ways forward.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm now going to come back to the lead speakers for your concluding remarks. If anybody else would like to add a bit of a conclusion at the end, then do raise your hand. And we've got a little bit of time. I can add one or two to the list. But Kari, over to you for your concluding remarks.
You probably noticed that education was only one of the options. There are a lot of other entry points. Why education is important and why the national curricula is the key. That a little bit against what you said, we are not teaching few numbers of this. It starts in early education, it goes through the primary and continues to the secondary in every subject. So it's part of the culture of the school to learn how to find information correctly. So, and if we want to scale up something, the curricula, national curricula is the only way. I mean, we can do conferences and teacher trainings, but it's very little number of teachers who get trained. But if it's in the curricula, teachers have to do it. And I agree totally that this should be only the students. I've been given a lot of trainings for elderly people who are absolutely lost with the online environment. We have created this kind of digital survival kit for pensioners. And it's hugely important for them because they do believe on what is written, and when they see it in screen, they are easy targets for all kind of scams and frauds. And the last thing is that there is also a carrot. OECD has been quite clever. In the PISA 2025, there is a new competence, how to evaluate and use scientific information for decision making. And all the countries who want to get good score on PISA have to now reflect on how to teach the 15-year-olds to deal with this kind of issues. Thank you so much for interesting discussion.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And Richard Allan, could I just interject, as I did with Marcus, and say, could you address or mention the funding you've just received from Google? Are they trying to push the debate in a direction, or are they as confused as everyone else?
Yeah, I'll go down. I was just going to react to Kari telling us about another PISA score that Finland can win at. Great. We are envious. On the funding specifically, so what Google has done is it has given money to the Gulbenkian Foundation. So they've literally handed money over where they have no control over it to an independent foundation. That money is for research into disinformation. It will be directed by the European Digital Media Observatory. Okay. So we will decide which research or advise on which researchers should receive that money. But Google is completely hands-on. The structure has been deliberately set up so that Google has no say over it. And frankly, from their point of view, they don't want that, because whenever they fund research, nobody trusts it because they funded it. So they did want to make a contribution. We want to get money into the research community, but we wanted to create a structure where once they've signed the check, it's gone. It's Gulbenkian Foundation's money. And then Gulbenkian Foundation will give it to researchers on the advice of European University Institute and EDMO. We'll help pick researchers who can do things with it, independently of Google. So that's on that. And then just in my closing remarks, I just want to pick up on comments from both Nick and Lucy about funding, which I think is critical. To pick up on Evan's analogy, to a certain extent, we may be spending a hell of a lot of time worrying about who gets to run the blood bank, whilst ignoring the fact that there's no blood left in it. Because it's all gone out. And if you look, when Evan and I were at primary school, Exalt Infant School together in Sheffield, we could have bought a local Sheffield morning newspaper on the way to school in the morning and an evening newspaper on the way home. And if you read Alan Rusbridge's memoirs and others, there was really easy money in local news. You had a monopoly over classified ads, over jobs ads. You were rolling in cash, and that's what allowed you to fund high quality local journalism. That money's gone, it's never coming back. And we are left with this question, I think Nick's raised it, of, how many full-time professional journalists do we need to keep an eye on Shaffaq and his friends in Sheffield and the local courts and the local hospitals? Is it 20, is it 50, is it 100? And having decided that, how much are they going to cost, and then who's going to pay for it? And then critically, again, we can get a little bit hung up too much on the source of the income. I actually think the structure of the payment system is, again, the profound political question, because if you give that money to government, whoever you tax, you give it to government and government directs it, they have an agenda, or is it an independent foundation, or is it, the BBC, or who is it? So deciding how many journalists we need as a society in different areas, and then figuring out how to pay for them, I think is perhaps the most profound question when we're thinking about sort of truth in media. And then critically from a political point of view, what are the structures that mean that that's genuinely independent and not captured by any particular lobby? I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you. And then Richard Reeves.
Thank you. Some of my work's been done. Marie, thank you for the point of correction on the Reuters Institute, which is a separate think tank on this matter, and the complexity of detail is there. I think the education point, Kari, is really interesting. I think everyone agrees that this is such a complex challenge that it's just one part of it. But it's an important part, and there is no quick and easy fix. I think the most compelling, and it's because it's been every day of my life for the last 6 years since I took over running the AOP, which, as I say, my job is to represent the interests of media owner organisations, and it's what Nick said about the broken business model. The BBC, obviously, in the UK, to some degree, is a bit of an exception to that rule. But I don't think it's lost on anyone in this room. I'm sure you all read in great detail the Cairncross report, and I'm sure you're aware of the impact that has on our society, the direct impact on local journalism. But, just to sort of try and frame it in such a way, Nick, and I'm sure other news groups would argue or discuss this with Nick around the fact that, is it actually just down to a resource issue? Well, all of these businesses have been battling news gathering organisations, as one example, to create a sustainable future for themselves. Because now, and I only operate in the digital world, so I'll only talk to that, but 80% of the revenue that is spent through advertising makes itself to Facebook and Google and nowhere else. And those media organisations that are trying to sustain their businesses have learnt to wean themselves off the dependency that existed for so long around advertising. But the risk to us as a society with them doing that and protecting and future-proofing their businesses is getting access to honest, trustful news going to be even harder for. the Joe blogs on the street and the kids going through education systems, it's all going to be behind paywalls. And I think for me, and I've always had this opinion, but it's a private opinion, and I struggle because I know it's not a sensible thing to say on public platforms. And this isn't me necessarily accusing politicians of anything, but when we talk about trying to defend the truth, I think politicians and people like myself, we all stood by and watched decimation of that business model that Nick refers to. And I think I grew up and ended up in an industry where I didn't know how it worked, but my assumption was if a newspaper carried an ad, in the same way as a newspaper's held accountable for what it says in a story, it is equally accountable for allowing commercial messages to exist in their environment. So my interpretation of life as a kid was that if that brand is in my dad's copy of the Times or whatever, it's probably a really good brand or entirely trustworthy. And I still am greatly challenged. I know a number of people, there's a lot of reasons why this can't be the case, but I am challenged by the fact that some of you have actually referred to social media platforms as publishers today. As you know, they rigorously defend the fact that they aren't, because that's why they're not held accountable. But my view is, and I think it could be the greatest gift that politicians can make for, you know, that business model that's so broken, and my industry, is that we should view the fact that if an organization supports commercial messages, wherever they place those commercial messages, they therefore, in order to have the privilege to support advertising, should by definition be accountable for everything that is on the page or when that commercial message appears. And I'll tell you what, if that had been the case economically and societally, we'd be in a very different place.
Thank you. And Evan, for the final comment.
Sorry, this is the final comment because it's going to be defensive. Let me make a broader point first to make my point not so small-minded about the Reuters Institute. We don't just face a crisis of misinformation, we face a crisis of trust in the UK anyway. And the barometer studies, the EBU barometer studies show that it's worse in the UK than almost anywhere else, even worse than some of the countries with more serious problems than we have in terms of media freedom. And so even if we repair the information media, how do we restore trust? How do we show that it's repaired? And one way is not to have misinformation about the problem. And this is the point I made. In April 2020, Reuters put out a news release. I get it. Reuters Institute. I know what I'm talking about. Trust me. Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism in Oxford, my old constituency, said news media broadly trusted as source of coronavirus information. Right? That was the headline. That was purely based on a massive trust measure for the BBC. Okay, 60%, which is very high because we're less trusting player. You know, doctors aren't that much higher actually in judges than 60% BBC News. ITV 40 and Channel 4 30, and newspapers way down. So news media is narrowly trusted as a source of input, not broadly trusted. And I wrote to Reuters and said, your headline, which was dutifully reported by the tabloids, saying we're broadly trusted, says Reuters. They said, oh, well, you know, it's just a headline. It's not, that's the way that reached the population. And that's a form of misinformation. And I expected better from Reuters because I admire them and I read their work. And thank goodness for the BBC, in fact. You know, they're a flawed organization, but nevertheless, thank goodness, because they're rightly trusted. But the attacks that we're seeing on the BBC are not just damaging to the BBC, but will reduce trust overall, and therefore attacks ought to be justified and not made out of what are clearly, at least in part, self-interested partisan attacks by politicians and their rivals.
Sorry. No, that's it.
Well, I wasn't to reply to Evan, actually. It was just
30 seconds, but 30 seconds.
It was Stefanie's point about what we saw during coronavirus was the evidence of people flocking to those news gathering organizations for that. The business model Nick made point, the business model point was, we live in a world of technologies that dominate the decisions. Those technologies block ads from, or advertisers from appearing in those news pages. So actually, despite the traffic, newspapers in the UK lost potentially 50 million worth of revenue, because again, stupid, ignorant technologies programmed by machines.
Okay, and on that really optimistic note, so I would like to take my own 2 minutes to say thank you. Really thank you everyone who's taken part. This has been a much more interesting debate than I possibly could have hoped for. Myself, I used to make documentaries at the BBC for 30 years. I was in the science department. I used to make Horizon and things like that. And I would go out and meet individual experts. And my dream was always, wouldn't it be great if I could get them all in one room just to hear what they said to each other? So thank you. We're not making a documentary, but you have fulfilled my dream in that sense. And it is very worthwhile. And I really look forward to the next edition. And I should tell you, this recording will appear on the European Liberal Foundation pages at some point, and it will appear on the Paddy Ashdown Forum page. We also are going to make a booklet, a pamphlet, but it'll be an electronic one. Lucy's leading on that, and I'm working with her. It'll probably take us a little while to do it, but we will distribute it to you. And I hope it includes chunky transcripts from what we've been saying, because thank you, everyone. You have been fascinating. So good for you. Tap each other. Thank you. You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucy.
You're very welcome. You're very welcome. Okay, I am going to end the meeting. 3, 2, 1.
Take care, Richard. See you
Bye,
soon.
everybody. Bye-bye. Thanks, Kari. Bye-bye. Gone.